In the quiet town of Brookline, Massachusetts, life had a comfortable, predictable rhythm. It was the kind of place where neighbors waved from their front porches, and weekends were filled with family barbecues and strolls along Harvard Street. The Davis family fit right in. On the surface, they seemed to have everything: a charming colonial house on Beals Street, a successful career for Mark Davis, and a well-respected social standing due to Olivia Hart, Mark's wife, who came from one of Brookline's most affluent families. Mark and Olivia had been married for nearly 5 years, having met through mutual friends. Olivia was everything Mark had ever wanted. She was beautiful, intelligent, and came from a family with deep ties in the town. She worked as an art curator, immersing herself in culture and creativity, while Mark had a solid job as a software developer in Cambridge. Their relationship had been picture perfect in the early years, but lately cracks had begun to show, cracks that neither of them could quite put their finger on. The turning point came when Olivia's father, Robert Hart, moved in temporarily. Robert, in his early 60s, had recently experienced a health scare and needed to recover somewhere comfortable. Olivia had insisted he stay with them, and Mark had agreed, though he had no idea how this decision would upend his life. Robert was a distinguished figure in the community, a retired lawyer who had spent decades charming courtrooms and town hall meetings alike. He was known for his sharp mind, his charisma, and his towering presence. Despite his age, he still carried himself with an energy that belied his years. He was the kind of man who commanded attention when he entered a room, and Mark found himself drawn to him in ways that were confusing at first. Initially, Mark and Robert's relationship was casual. They bonded over books and politics, often staying up late discussing everything from local issues to world events. Mark found Robert's intellect magnetic. It was refreshing, a break from the mundane conversations he had at work, or even with Olivia. But as the weeks passed, something in their dynamic shifted. It started subtly. Mark began noticing the way Robert's hand would linger on his shoulder a moment longer than necessary, or how Robert's gaze would rest on him just a beat too long. At first, Mark dismissed it as a figment of his imagination, but as time went on, the energy between them became undeniable. One evening in late August, everything changed. Olivia had left for a weekend art exhibition in New York, leaving Mark and Robert alone in the house. It was a warm night, and the two men sat on the porch, sipping whiskey as the summer breeze rustled the trees. They were talking as they often did, but tonight felt different. There was a tension in the air, thick and heavy, making the words between them feel loaded with unspoken meaning. Robert set his glass down and turned to Mark, his voice quieter than usual. "There's something between us, isn't there?" The question hung in the air like a live wire. Mark's heart raced as he avoided eye contact, staring into his glass as if the amber liquid could offer an escape. He had known this moment was coming, but he hadn't been prepared for it. "I don't know what you mean," Mark finally said, though he knew perfectly well. Robert wasn't deterred. He leaned closer, his voice steady. "You do. You feel it too." Mark's chest tightened, and he could feel the walls closing in. He wanted to deny it, to laugh it off, to change the subject, but the words wouldn't come. And then, without thinking, he looked up and met Robert's gaze. In that moment, everything shifted. Before Mark could process what was happening, Robert's hand was on his knee, and then his lips were on his. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, but it quickly deepened, filled with the passion of something long denied. Mark's mind screamed at him to stop, but his body had already made the decision. He kissed Robert back with a hunger he hadn't realized he'd been suppressing for years. They spent the rest of the weekend together, lost in each other. It was a whirlwind of passion and guilt, an affair that felt both inevitable and dangerous. Mark had never been with a man before, and the rush of emotions terrified him. Yet at the same time, he felt more alive than he had in years. Robert, for his part, was calm and confident, as though he had always known this was where their relationship would lead. By the time Olivia returned home late Sunday night, everything had changed. Mark and Robert had agreed that what had happened between them would remain a secret, something they would never speak of again. They convinced themselves it was a one-time thing, a mistake that could be buried deep enough to never resurface. But secrets like that never stay hidden for long. In the days following Olivia's return, Mark couldn't shake the feeling of dread that settled in his chest. He avoided Robert as much as possible, and when they were forced to interact, the tension between them was palpable. Every glance felt heavy, every touch electric. But more than that, Mark felt a growing sense of guilt. He loved Olivia, or at least he thought he did, but what had happened with Robert had changed something fundamental inside him. Olivia began to notice the changes in her husband almost immediately. He was distant, distracted, and she couldn't understand why. Mark had always been attentive and affectionate, but now it was as though he was 1,000 miles away, even when he was sitting right next to her. "Is everything okay?" she asked one night as they lay in bed. "You've been different lately." Mark's stomach twisted, and he forced a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I've just been stressed with work," he lied, turning on his side to avoid her gaze. "It's nothing." But it wasn't nothing, and Olivia knew it. She didn't press him further, but the seed of doubt had been planted, and it was growing with each passing day. Meanwhile, Robert seemed unfazed by the affair. He continued to flirt with Mark in subtle, almost imperceptible ways when Olivia wasn't around. A brush of the hand here, a lingering glance there. It was as though Robert thrived on the secrecy, on the thrill of knowing they were playing with fire. For Mark, it was suffocating. He felt like he was living a double life, trapped between his love for Olivia and the forbidden passion he shared with her father. The guilt was eating him alive, but the more he tried to pull away from Robert, the more drawn to him he became. One evening, about a month after the affair began, things came to a head. Olivia had gone to bed early, exhausted from a long day at the gallery, leaving Mark and Robert alone once again in the living room. The air between them crackled with unspoken tension, and Mark could feel the walls closing in. "This can't go on," Mark said quietly, breaking the silence. His voice trembled slightly, betraying his nerves. "We have to stop." Robert looked at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Do you really want to stop?" he asked, his voice soft, almost challenging. Mark didn't answer right away. He knew what the right answer was, but the truth was harder to admit. Finally, he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's wrong, Robert. This whole thing. It's wrong." "Why?" Robert countered, standing up and crossing the room to stand in front of Mark. "Because society says so? Because you're married to my daughter?" "Yes," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And because it's tearing me apart." Robert's gaze softened and he reached out, cupping Mark's face in his hands. "I don't want to lose you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Mark closed his eyes, leaning into Robert's touch for just a moment before pulling away. "We don't have a choice." The weight of those words hung in the air, heavy and final. But Mark knew deep down that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The days after Mark's declaration that they had to stop weighed heavily on him. He threw himself into work, taking on more projects and staying late at the office, anything to avoid being at home. Avoiding Robert had become his #1 priority, but that was easier said than done. Robert wasn't just part of his life anymore, he was part of his home. Olivia was growing more suspicious by the day. Her intuition had always been sharp, and while Mark could brush off his behavior as stress from work for a time, she could sense that something far deeper was amiss. She asked him about it again, but each time Mark deflected with the same empty responses. One Saturday morning, as Olivia was making breakfast, she casually mentioned that her father would be visiting a friend for the weekend. The news should have filled Mark with relief. He hadn't realized how much he had been holding his breath, dreading each passing moment that Robert could corner him again, insisting on reigniting what Mark was desperately trying to suppress. "I thought you'd be happy about a quiet weekend," Olivia teased as she set a plate in front of him. Mark forced a smile. "Yeah, that sounds nice," he said, his voice too light, too strained. But the story didn't end there. Olivia had been planning a surprise for Mark, a weekend trip to Cape Cod, just the two of them. She'd been growing more and more worried about their relationship and thought that time away from Brookline might help them reconnect. After all, they used to have fun together. They used to talk late into the night, laugh about silly things, and share moments of genuine intimacy. But those days felt like they were slipping away from her grasp. After breakfast, she sprung the news. "Pack your bags," she said with a mischievous smile, holding up 2 printed tickets. "We're going to the Cape for the weekend." Mark's heart skipped a beat. The idea of being alone with Olivia, without the oppressive presence of Robert lurking in the background, should have excited him. Instead, it filled him with a strange mix of dread and guilt. But he nodded and smiled, hoping he could fake it long enough for the weekend to pass without her noticing the turmoil inside him. They left that afternoon, driving down the scenic route along Route 3. The sunlight flickered through the trees as the car hummed along the highway, and for a while it felt like the old days. Olivia laughed and told stories about the gallery, and Mark responded when he could, though his mind was elsewhere, constantly drifting back to Robert. Once they arrived at the small, quaint cottage on the Cape, Olivia seemed to relax. She had booked a charming little place near the water, where the ocean breeze filled the air with salt and the seagulls cawed in the distance. It was picturesque, the kind of romantic escape that should have brought them closer together. But no matter how hard Mark tried to immerse himself in the moment, the weight of his guilt followed him like a shadow. The first night, as they sat by the fire pit under the stars, Olivia leaned in closer to him, her hand gently brushing his arm. "Mark," she whispered, her voice soft but insistent, "I miss you." Mark's chest tightened. He looked at her, seeing the love and concern in her eyes, and it hit him like a punch to the gut. She had no idea what had been happening, and yet here she was, trying to salvage a marriage that had been unraveling behind her back. He couldn't bring himself to meet her gaze for long, so he stared into the fire instead. "I'm right here," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. He knew he wasn't, not in the way she needed him to be. "No, you're not," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You've been gone for months, Mark. I don't know where you are anymore." The tension between them had been building for so long, it was bound to break. And now, sitting by the fire with the stars above them, Olivia's patience finally gave way. "Is there someone else?" she asked, her words cutting through the quiet night like a blade. Mark felt his heart drop into his stomach. His first instinct was to deny it, to shake his head and tell her she was imagining things. But Olivia wasn't stupid. She could see through him, and lying now would only deepen the betrayal when the truth inevitably came out. "No," he whispered, though his voice wavered. "It's not that." "Then what is it?" she pressed, her eyes searching his face for any sign of the truth. Mark's mouth went dry, and for a moment he considered telling her everything. The affair, the guilt, the shame. It all rose to the surface, threatening to spill over. But he couldn't do it. He couldn't destroy her like that. "I've just been struggling," he said, forcing the words out. "With work, with everything. I'm sorry if I've been distant." Olivia studied him for a long moment, and for a second he thought she might push further. But then she sighed, a deep, weary sound. "I just want us to be okay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark nodded, though he knew that no matter what he said, things were far from okay. That night, as Olivia slept beside him in the cottage's cozy bedroom, Mark lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His mind kept drifting back to Robert, back to the affair that had torn his life apart in ways he hadn't expected. He knew that he couldn't keep living like this, that something had to give. But he didn't know how to untangle himself from the web of lies he had created. When they returned home from Cape Cod, Mark tried to throw himself back into his routine. He kept his distance from Robert as much as possible, and for a while it seemed to work. But the tension between them never fully dissipated. Robert, ever the composed and confident man, didn't push, but his presence alone was enough to keep Mark on edge. It wasn't until a few weeks later that everything came crashing down. It was a Sunday afternoon, and Olivia had gone to visit a friend. Mark had planned to spend the day catching up on work, but Robert had other plans. He found Mark in the study, sitting at his desk with his laptop open, pretending to focus on emails. "We need to talk," Robert said, his voice firm but calm as he closed the door behind him. Mark tensed, refusing to look up. "There's nothing to talk about," he said, though even he didn't believe it. "There's plenty to talk about," Robert replied, taking a seat across from him. "We can't just pretend that nothing happened." Mark's hands tightened on the edge of the desk, his knuckles turning white. "It was a mistake. We both know that." Robert leaned forward, his voice lowering. "Do you really believe that?" Mark finally looked up, meeting Robert's intense gaze. "Yes," he said, though the word felt like a lie even as it left his mouth. Robert sighed, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair. "I don't," he said quietly. "What happened between us wasn't a mistake, Mark. You felt it, just like I did." The room was filled with an unbearable tension as they stared at each other, the weight of their shared secret pressing down on them both. Mark wanted to scream, to tell Robert to leave him alone, but he couldn't, because deep down, a part of him didn't want to let go. Before Mark could respond, the sound of the front door opening echoed through the house. Olivia was home. Mark and Robert both jumped, the moment between them shattered. Robert stood up quickly, straightening his shirt and forcing a calm expression onto his face. "This isn't over," he whispered before slipping out of the room, leaving Mark alone with his racing thoughts. That evening, during dinner, the tension in the air was suffocating. Mark barely touched his food, and Robert avoided eye contact with both him and Olivia. But Olivia wasn't oblivious. She sensed that something was off, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what. As they cleared the dishes, she asked, "Is everything okay? You both seem tense." Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he forced a smile. "Just tired," he said, his voice tight. "It's been a long day." But Olivia wasn't convinced. She glanced at her father, who quickly excused himself from the table, claiming he had work to finish in his room. The moment he left, Olivia turned to Mark, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Are you sure there's nothing going on?" she asked, her voice laced with suspicion. Mark froze, his mind racing. He wanted to tell her the truth, to get it all out in the open and finally be free of the burden that had been eating away at him. But before he could say anything, Olivia's phone buzzed, distracting her for a moment. Mark took a deep breath, his hands trembling under the table. He knew the truth would come out sooner or later, but he wasn't ready for it yet. Not yet. Mark could feel it building, the weight of the secrets, the tension, the guilt. It was all spiraling towards something inevitable. His life had become a series of stolen glances, whispered words, and suffocating lies. Olivia had grown more distant, her suspicions clear, though she hadn't yet confronted him directly. But Mark knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. Robert had been keeping his distance since that last conversation, but his presence lingered in every room, in every moment of silence. There was a storm brewing beneath the surface, and Mark could feel it coming. He tried to focus on work, on the daily routine, but nothing seemed real anymore. He was living in a state of perpetual anxiety, waiting for the inevitable collapse. One evening, Olivia suggested they have dinner with her father. "It's been a while since we've all had a meal together," she said, her voice strained, though she tried to hide it with a smile. "I think it'll be good for us." Mark agreed, though the thought of sitting at a table with Robert made his stomach churn. The three of them had barely spent any time together since the affair had begun, and now, with the walls closing in, he wasn't sure how he would handle it. But he knew he had to keep up the charade, at least for a little longer. The night of the dinner, the air in the house felt thick and oppressive. Mark could barely meet Robert's gaze as they sat around the table, the clinking of silverware the only sound breaking the tense silence. Olivia chatted politely, though her words felt hollow, and the conversation barely flowed. "How's work, Mark?" Robert asked at one point, his tone casual, but there was something behind his eyes, something darker. Mark swallowed hard. "It's fine," he muttered, not wanting to elaborate. He kept his eyes fixed on his plate, avoiding the searing gaze that Olivia had begun to cast at both of them. The evening dragged on, every moment feeling like an eternity. Mark's heart raced, and his hands felt clammy, the weight of his lies crushing him from all sides. He could feel Olivia watching him, her suspicions mounting. He could feel Robert sitting too close, his presence too familiar, too suffocating. And then Olivia broke the silence. "I think we need to talk," she said, her voice calm but heavy with meaning. She set her fork down and looked between Mark and her father, her eyes sharp. "Something's been off for months now, and I need to know what's going on." Mark froze, his mind racing. This was it, the moment he had been dreading for weeks. He glanced at Robert, who remained silent, his expression unreadable. "Olivia," Mark began, his voice shaking, "I don't know what you're talking about." But Olivia wasn't backing down. "Don't lie to me, Mark," she said, her voice rising slightly. "I'm not blind. I know something's been happening between you two." She turned to her father, her eyes narrowing. "You've both been acting strange for months." Robert's face remained calm, but his eyes flicked to Mark, warning him to stay quiet. But Mark couldn't do it anymore. He couldn't keep up the lies, not with Olivia looking at him like that, like she already knew the truth. "I'm sorry," Mark whispered, his voice barely audible. "I never meant for this to happen." Olivia's face drained of color, and for a moment she looked like she had been struck. "What?" she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. Mark felt like he was drowning. His heart pounded in his chest as the weight of the confession pressed down on him. It was a mistake," he stammered. "I didn't mean to hurt you. It just happened," Olivia interrupted, her voice shaking with anger. "What are you saying, Mark? What did you do?" The room felt like it was closing in, the air thick with tension. Mark opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He glanced at Robert, who remained silent, his expression cold and distant. It was as if he was watching the scene from afar, detached from the chaos unfolding before him. Olivia stood up, pushing her chair back so hard it scraped against the floor. "Tell me what happened," she shouted, her voice breaking. Mark's hands shook as he stood up as well, trying to find the words, trying to explain the unexplainable. I don't know how it started," he whispered. "It was just you and my father." Olivia's voice was sharp, cutting through the silence like a knife. Mark couldn't deny it. His silence was enough. Olivia's face twisted with rage, her eyes blazing with fury. "How long?" she demanded. "How long has this been going on?" "Olivia, please," Robert finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "It's not what you think." But Olivia wasn't listening. She turned on Mark, her voice trembling with anger. "You've been lying to me for months? With my own father?" Mark could barely breathe. He wanted to deny it, to tell her that it wasn't as bad as it seemed, but the truth was staring them all in the face. There was no going back now. The rage in Olivia's eyes grew, and before anyone could stop her, she grabbed the nearest object, a heavy ceramic vase that had been sitting on the side table, and hurled it at Mark. The vase shattered against the wall, missing him by inches, but the explosion of sound sent a shockwave through the room. "Get out!" Olivia screamed, her voice raw with emotion. "Get out of my house!" Mark stood frozen, his mind reeling, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to say something, to fix it, but he knew there was nothing he could do. He had destroyed everything. Robert stood up then, moving toward Olivia, his hands raised in a calming gesture. "Olivia, you need to calm down," he said quietly. "This isn't— Don't you dare tell me to calm down," Olivia shrieked, backing away from him. You disgusting, how could you do this to me?" Robert's expression darkened, and for the first time, Mark saw a flicker of something dangerous in his eyes. "Olivia," he said, his voice low and controlled, "you need to think about what you're saying." But Olivia was beyond reasoning. Her chest heaved with fury, and her hands shook as she backed away from them both. "You're both disgusting," she spat. "I can't believe I didn't see this sooner." And then, in an instant, everything changed. Mark saw it happen as if in slow motion. Robert's face twisted with anger, and before Mark could react, Robert grabbed a large kitchen knife from the counter. His movements were fast, almost instinctual, as he lunged at Olivia. "Robert, no!" Mark screamed, but it was too late. The knife sank into Olivia's chest with a sickening thud, and the room was filled with her choking gasp of surprise and pain. She stumbled back, her eyes wide with shock, her hands clutching at the wound as blood began to pour from her body. Mark felt frozen in place, watching in horror as Olivia fell to the ground, her body crumpling on the kitchen floor. Blood pooled around her, dark and sticky, soaking into the hardwood as she gasped for breath, her eyes locked on Mark. Robert stood over her, the bloody knife still in his hand, his chest heaving with adrenaline. His eyes were wild, his face pale, as if he couldn't quite comprehend what he had just done. Mark finally snapped out of his stupor and rushed to Olivia's side, kneeling in the pool of blood as he cradled her in his arms. "Oh God," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Oh God, what have you done?" Olivia's breathing was shallow, her eyes glazing over as she struggled to speak. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why?" Mark sobbed, holding her tighter, but there was nothing he could do. He could feel her life slipping away in his arms, the blood warm and slick between his fingers. "I'm so sorry," he cried. "I'm so sorry." But it was too late. The light faded from Olivia's eyes, and she went limp in his arms. The room was deathly silent. Robert dropped the knife, the clatter echoing in the stillness, and took a step back, his face pale and stricken. "I didn't mean," he began, but the words died in his throat. Mark looked up at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of horror and rage. "You killed her," he whispered, his voice hoarse with grief. "You killed her." Robert took another step back, his hands trembling as the realization of what he had done sank in. "It was an accident," he stammered. "I didn't mean to—" But Mark wasn't listening. He stood up slowly, his hands still slick with Olivia's blood, and turned to face Robert. "Get out," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Robert hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting between Mark and the lifeless body of his daughter on the floor. Then, without another word, he turned and fled the house, disappearing into the night. Mark stood there, alone in the kitchen, the weight of what had just happened crashing down on him like a tidal wave. Olivia was dead. His world was shattered. He had loved Olivia once, but now her lifeless body was a testament to his betrayal. Robert's footsteps grew distant as he fled into the night, leaving Mark alone with the unbearable silence. The days that followed felt like a blur, the weight of the secret suffocating him. Mark tried to go back to his routine, but everywhere he looked he saw Olivia, her smile, her warmth, now gone forever. He became paranoid, convinced that Robert would return to finish what they started. And then, late one night, the phone rang. A voice on the other end whispered, "You'll never escape this." Mark knew it wasn't over. It would never be over.